You must be the son of Gun Jesus. Hey look, it's the lost son of Brandon Herrera. Wendigun. If Ian is Gun Jesus, then you are Gun Peter. It's like admin, but on a PBS budget. Off-brand Wendigun. Jonathan Ferguson's American nephew. You're definitely Ian's son. Big beard Wendigoon, for real. We have Brendan Herrera at home. You look like Donut Operator if he was Muslim. Disney Neckbeard Wendigoon. Hello, Brendan Herrera from Team. You look like Wendigoon, but if he was cloned and escaped the lab. You're like a bargain bin, Brandon Herrera. Wendigoon, but with more gub. Ian, you're getting fatter than usual. You are not Brendan Herrera. You are not Jonathan Ferguson. You are not Donut Operator. You are not hip with the kids. You are not funny. Now give me the Iceberg. Hi, I'm Darth Brandybuck, small-time YouTuber, alleged Wendigoon copycat, and creator of the wiki page for Fortnite on IMFDB. And yes, women did avoid me in college. Now apparently my identity online is up for some speculation, but I can rest easy knowing that my personal information is safe thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Aura. Have you ever felt targeted by robocalls and spam emails, or been afraid that you're just one mouse click away from unknowingly giving some random person access to details like your address or banking information? Well, newsflash, you are. There is a staggering amount of places your personal information can be found, bought, and traded online, all without your knowledge or consent. Data brokers take details like your name, phone number, email address, and more to sell it to all kinds of people for all kinds of uses. Now you can send out takedown requests to these places and they are legally required to comply, but it's a bit of a process and oftentimes your information will just pop up somewhere else. But that's where Aura comes in. Aura protects your privacy by identifying data brokers selling your info, distributing those takedown requests on your behalf, and monitoring for anywhere it might show up again to ensure that your private information stays private. Aura also provides antivirus and VPN services, credit monitoring, password management, and up to $5 million in identity theft insurance, all backed by 24/7 US-based customer support. And if you sign up now using my link at aura.com/brandybuck, you'll get a 14-day free trial, which gives Aura plenty of time to start scrubbing your information from places you don't want it. So join me and millions of other users in a safer online experience today with Aura, and now join me in one more exploration of some weird guns. I recently broke the 10,000 subscriber threshold, all thanks to you, and as promised, we're going to talk about the guns you all mentioned in the comments, even though I would have probably done this video either way. So thank you all for the support, thank you all for your suggestions, because there are some real gems here. And as usual, we are going to start off with another shotgun, the Cripple Shotgun. No, really, that's what it's called. While not exactly one specific model of firearm, the concept of a Cripple Shotgun is perhaps most well known for the ones made by the Benjamin Wild & Sons company. They were really nothing more than a typical double-barrel shotgun with a curved buttstock that allowed the shooter to shoulder it on one side of the body and use the opposite eye to aim. These were primarily made in a right-handed orientation to be shot off of the left eye, since apparently being left-handed back then was considered a disability. Having a dominant left eye while being right-handed can be a little difficult for shooting, so using the cripple stock was one way to make shooting easier without having to learn how to shoot all over again in a left-handed orientation. The Nikonov machine gun was a prototype Soviet rifle from around the same time as the AN-94's development that had dual reciprocating barrels that would use each other's recoil to run the action. Now, I would assume that this mechanism was way too complicated and costly for wide-scale production because there's really not much else info out there on it. If you've played the first Black Ops game, then you probably remember the ASP, which was a customized Smith & Wesson 39 with a shortened barrel, clear plastic grip plates, a rounded-off hammer that sat flush with the slide, and a few other features that inspired many of the compact conceal carry guns that came afterwards. One of the coolest features was the gutter snipe sight, which eliminated the need for a front sight due to the tapered V-notch on the back of the gun that made a much more flat and featureless top end. A similar modern equivalent to the gutter snipe is the SAS sights on certain variants of the SIG 365, with the idea being that fewer things are poking out of the top and sides of the gun, therefore making it easier and more comfortable to conceal. The VSSK is an integrally suppressed Russian sniper rifle made in the early 2000s for special operation missions. It was designed to outperform the VSS in penetration while still remaining relatively quiet, and it does Exactly that. Now, while not quite as silent as the VSS, the VSSK is effective for anything all the way up to heavy body armor and light vehicle armor. The VSSK also has some siblings in the SHAK-12 and the RSH-12, which use modified STS-130 rounds shortened to accommodate for their smaller frames. The G41M was an earlier, less refined version of the iconic Gewehr 43. Germany was one of the last big militaries to start moving towards more semi- and full automatic weapons for regular infantry between the two world wars, and when the Soviets started using the SVTs and the US adopted the Garand, they figured that it was time to jump onto the bandwagon. The G41 was one of the first rifles that saw significant production in Germany at the start of the war, and it mostly saw use on the Eastern Front. Could you do me a huge favor? What? Could you bring me some water?
Yeah.
No, I mean, like, can I have a water to have in here with me?
I don't have water bottles anymore.
We have cups.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're a doll.
Damn.
One of the cool and interesting things about exploring weird guns is that sometimes a neat gun inspires someone to use it in a form of entertainment media, but that can also happen the other way around, and the movie gun ends up inspiring a real-world firearm. No, your eyes do not deceive you, that is an actual Indonesian soldier using the gun from RoboCop. That's right, the 1987 action movie about a cyborg cop fighting drug addicts in crime-ridden Detroit was apparently such a hit in Indonesia that the folks at Pindad Industries decided to make the Auto 9 real and issue it for soldiers. The gun in the movie is nothing more than a Beretta 93R with some extra furniture, and the Pindad PS01 mimics that same look and feel, with the biggest drawback being that it doesn't actually fire full auto, so it's basically just a 92 knockoff with a really big compensator. It does, however, use a proprietary 5.56 Pindad round that is basically just a regular 5.56 cartridge cut in half to be a PDW round similar to the 5.7. All the same, the lack of fully automatic fire kind of defeats the whole purpose, so only a handful were ever made for the initial trials. The Tao SMG was a Georgian homemade 9mm conversion of an AK cobbled together from spare parts. Only one was made, but the guys who built it were later employed by the State Defense Organization, and the gun itself was confiscated by Georgian police, later to disappear, presumably stolen, only to eventually be used in a robbery and recovered by the police again later. Standing for Quiet Special Purpose Revolver, the QSPR was built by AAI off of a Smith & Wesson Model 29S and is the American equivalent and precursor to the Russian OTS-38. It was modified to fire special 10mm rounds that were an earlier form of the same piston round concept of the SP4 cartridges, but rather than shooting one single slug, they fired a cluster of small pellets. The design of these QSPR rounds only put out a sound report of 110 decibels, which is equivalent to a suppressed 22, which was directly tied to the gun's intended purpose, which was more or less a tunnel clearing tool. The idea was that soldiers would use these revolvers when clearing Viet Cong tunnel systems, and they could quickly and effortlessly blast at anything deemed a threat down in those dimly lit passageways. And since you would be using these in the dark and didn't require precision aiming anyway, the guns didn't even come with sights on them. By the information I found, the QSPR revolvers seem to have worked fine and could have had a lot of applications while still, of course, very special use, but development of the project ended when the US pulled out of Vietnam. Now, back before John Garand created the iconic M1 rifle, he experimented with a few other earlier technologies as viable options for the military. One of his earliest designs, and probably the first that had any potential success, was his primer actuated prototype built for the 1924 weapon trials. Primer actuation is when the primer at the bottom of the cartridge actually ejects from the casing when firing, operating almost like a gas piston by pushing on an actuator attached to the firing pin and cycling the action. It serves a very similar purpose to typical gas blowback, but negates the need for a gas port or reciprocating barrel. In concept, primer actuation works fine, but the very nature of the idea requires specially built ammunition and can only work in certain mechanisms and firearm designs. John Garand tried a few different tweaks to the rifle, and it actually outperformed most other rifles in the trials, but when the US military modified the type of powder and primers used in the .30-06 cartridge in 1925, it rendered the gun completely obsolete due to changes in pressure and powder burn time, as well as the new primers not being compatible with that system. Now, all the same, the rifle was well regarded as a comfortable, innovative, and well-designed piece, and its reputation was certainly helpful in getting the M1 adopted several years later. While probably most well known for being built from cut-down Mosin Nagant rifles, the concept of an Obrez has become almost a meme at this point, and has been done in dozens of different rifles purely to see if it can be done. It's obviously more of a concept or sort of subclass of guns, but the actual word Obrez literally just means cut. Of course, people have been cutting down the stocks and barrels on guns for centuries, but the term originated during the Russian Civil War when revolutionary forces began converting their Mosin Nagant rifles into pistols to make concealment and close quarters fighting easier, since they didn't have easy access to actual handguns. The concept of an Obrez obviously is not a very practical idea, since shooting a full-size rifle round in a pistol isn't the most comfortable, and cutting off almost the entirety of the original gun makes aiming an operation a bit more difficult. But the gun was a product of desperation, and like I've said before, any gun is better than no gun. Since the Obrez is more of an idea than a specific design, many different guns have had the treatment, mostly as a joke, but we all know that the first rule of firearms is having fun. Now, many of us probably know the Vilar Perosa, which was an early submachine gun built as a double-barrel twin-magazine aircraft gun. You probably recognize it as the gun from the airplane battle in The Last Crusade, but the gun used in that movie actually wasn't a real Vilar Perosa, and was in fact two Beretta Model 38s turned upside down and slapped together. In reality, the Vilar Perosa was the original gun that was split in half and turned into a semi-automatic carbine called the Beretta Revelli. It kept the top-loaded magazine setup of the original aircraft gun, and a few different variants of the gun were made, seeing use by the Royal Italian Army, Argentinian police, and several other countries. We also already talked about a couple different ring pistols, which for those of you who don't remember, were similar in concept to the volcanic pistol in basic terms. Mostly came out of European countries and often used stripper clips or end block clips to load ammunition rather than something like a tube magazine. And they were kind of the middle ground between a revolver and early self-loading pistols. There were a few we didn't talk about yet, one being the Passler design. It was made in the late 1880s and saw a couple different minor changes over its short lifespan, but it never really saw much commercial success despite being one of the better ring pistol designs. A few other ring pistols were the Schullhoff, the Reiger, and the Berger pistols, which all operated under the same general idea despite very unique elements to their individual designs. The earliest true semi-automatic mechanism in a handgun that really saw any legitimate commercial success was the toggle action of guns like the C93 Borchardt or the P08 Luger. The toggle lock action was extremely versatile for the time, and even though it's not really used anymore today, it was even used in some heavy machine guns and rifles. One lesser-known submachine gun was the Führer 1919, which was basically a full-auto P08 Luger carbine turned on its side and put into a traditional rifle stock. The gun was designed by Adolf Führer, and no, that's not Adolf Führer, which is the other Adolf. Mr. Führer got the idea for the 1919 from the Bergmann NP-18 submachine gun, which ended up being a far more widely used and more recognizable gun than this one. Führer would go on to make some improvements to the 1919's design and scaled it up for 7.5 Swiss rifle rounds, resulting in the LMG-25, which saw service with the Swiss military for over 50 years before being replaced by the STGW-57. Führer would also develop the MP-41 submachine gun, which was plagued by both design and production issues, and despite seeing some official service, most were eventually scrapped. The Medusa 47 was a prospective survival revolver based on the Smith & Wesson K-frame family of wheel guns and designed by Phillips and Rogers in Huntsville, Texas, which coincidentally is also where I went to college. Eat 'em up, cats. The idea behind the gun was that it would be able to chamber and fire basically any pistol round under the 9mm umbrella, including .357, .38 Special, .380, 9 Makarov, and so on. But the problem with this is that even though all those cartridges are 9mm, they all have slight variations in dimensions and pressures and case design and a lot of other things, meaning that you can't expect to load the Medusa with 6 different rounds and expect consistent or reliable performance. To keep up with the different pressures of the different bullets expected to be used in this thing, it's built from much stronger materials than a stock K-frame revolver, and it has a modified cylinder chamber to handle both rimmed and rimless cartridges. From what I could gather, the Medusa 47 works and is well made, but the idea is kind of dumb and probably is only attractive to Mall Ninja Doomsday Prepper types. If it gets to the point where you are in a survival situation that has you scrounging around for any 9mm round you can find, then you are in very dire circumstances and only have yourself to blame for poor planning. The Hafdasa C4 was an Argentinian submachine gun built in 1938 and made in 9mm and 45 variants. It was largely built from aluminum, but it was also made with a wooden stock as well as shortened into a machine pistol. It uses quad-stacked magazines and had a firing rate of 900 rounds per minute, and despite performing pretty well for Argentinian tank crews, it never really saw much production or use since Argentina wasn't really involved in World War II. Another Argentinian submachine gun no one really knows about is the Patria Model 2, which is basically a cross between a bullpupped Glock 18 and a Beretta 93 Rafika, I think, because I couldn't find really any information about this thing aside from that it exists and it was made in the 1980s. The Pistola GMC is yet another Argentinian firearm, this one a .22 pistol inspired by the even lesser known Pantax pistol, which itself was based on the Fromer stop. It has no safety, no slide lock, and a very weak barrel that will crack or break with high velocity rounds, but from what I gather, it still saw a decent amount of circulation during its production. Standing for F Gun Control 9mm, the FGC-9 is an open source, semi-automatic pistol caliber carbine largely made from 3D printed components and metal parts like nuts, bolts, and springs that can be found at any regular hardware store. It was originally designed by a German Kurdish gun designer and is a sort of new age looty gun, which itself is probably the most recognizable and well-known homemade firearm design that can be constructed from non-firearm parts. Both of these guns and many like them were made in protest to heavy gun control and regulation on owning firearms, with the idea that everyone has the right to self-defense and protection regardless of the laws in the state or country they happen to live in. But it goes without saying that making or owning one of these is extremely controversial, and depending on where you live, can land you in a lot of trouble, so act accordingly with the information I just gave you. The Kjellman is one of, if not the first, fully automatic guns ever produced, with its patent being registered all the way in 1870, which is several years ahead of the Maxim light machine gun. Being such an early design, it was far from refined despite being pretty reliable in testing, but it was also far too expensive for production to be practical. The Marble Game Getter was a backpack hunting and survival gun that came with two barrels, usually chambered in either 22 LR and 44 shot shell or 22 LR and 410. It was first produced in 1908 to 1962 and then re-entered production in 2009. Now operationally they aren't really anything special, but being that they originally came standard with a 15-inch barrel, that makes them an NFA prohibited weapon as an AOE device, and 18-inch or longer barrels fall under the same regulation if the stock is removed, since it puts the overall length under 16 inches. Meaning that, according to the ATF, this 117-year-old gun is just as dangerous and scary for civilians to own as a grenade launcher and machine gun, because that makes sense. The Fontbernaut Labora was a short-lived small production submachine gun built during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s as a locally made weapon for Republican Army forces, but it ended up being too financially and logistically difficult to make mass scale. The few that were made popped up throughout France and Spain among resistance groups fighting against German occupiers in World War II, but only a handful still survive today in various museums. The Slostin machine gun was a Russian post-war attempt at making a, at the time, modern self-powered recreation of the Gatling gun, predating the earliest iterations of the American M61 Vulcan by over a decade. As was typical with many an early experimental firearm, it worked fine and made a positive impression, but it was too complicated and costly to make on a large scale. The US also attempted a modernized Gatling gun in the 40s called the Vega machine gun, but I could only find a few forum posts and patent documents about this gun with no real confirmation of whether or not the gun itself was ever actually made. It did, or at least would have fired, a round called 12mm Vega, which was basically a 50 BMG shell necked up for larger projectiles used in aircraft cannons. Now, sometimes referred to as the unicorn of belt-fed light machine guns, the Colt machine gun, or CMG, was built as a companion to the Kar-15 in the 60s as a competitor to the Stoner 63. It could probably be considered one of the earliest belt-fed conversions of the M16, and while the first model of the CMG used many of the same design ideas functionally, the third and final iteration was basically an entirely different gun. Its most defining features were a broom ejector that literally swept spent shells out of the firing chamber with a paddle-like lever, a reversible firing pin for if one side became worn down or broken, and a quick-change barrel held in place by a latch similar to the MG42. The CMG saw some travel use with the Navy SEALs, but after the 3 redesigns, the final version wore out too quickly with heavy use, and the Stoner 63 was deemed the better option after all. As likely the largest handgun ever made, the Pfeiffer Zeliska Revolver clocks in at a whopping 13-pound weight with a 13-inch barrel and fires the 600 Nitro Express cartridge, also making it one of the most powerful handguns ever made, with a muzzle velocity of over 4,500 foot-pounds, rivaled only by other massive revolvers like 500 Bushwhacker, made by Magnum Research. It's obviously a very special case and made in limited numbers, but it's really just a massively scaled-up single-action army. Now, you'd probably be surprised to know that over 10 years before Brandon Herrera began working on the AK-50, the Degtyarev plant in Russia already made their version of the idea with the 6P62 chambered in 12.7x108, used in the Dishka heavy machine gun, which is basically just the Russian equivalent to 50 BMG. The 6P62 is far from a refined design, with a boxy frame, oversized controls, and a magazine size of only 12 rounds, making it far too cumbersome and low capacity to be practical, especially when there are other perfectly capable weapons out there. You've probably realized that it's very common for developing or low GDP countries to use surplus, retired, or licensed reproductions of guns made or used by other countries. If you've ever wondered how Cold War era weapons got from countries like the US or England to places like the South Pacific, Africa, or South America, that's usually why. Sometimes these guns will get special modifications by the country or military they end up with, a great example being the Type 11 assault rifle from Thailand, which is a derivative of the HK-33. While the base rifle is really nothing special, the Thai army did also make a bullpup version that has the carry handle and gas block sights of the M16. There's not really much information I could find on it, so I don't know if it's seen any wide-scale use or even production beyond a few prototypes, but it does indeed exist, and it's kind of interesting, if not a little quirky. We've also already talked about a few pistols already that are a fusion of a magazine-fed autoloader and a revolver, such as the Dardic or Landstat, but there was at least one other pistol that attempted the idea, that being the Argentinian Garcia Reynoso. Also, I'm just now realizing how many interesting guns came out of Argentina, so they must have some really creative guys down there. Anyway, the gun held 5 rounds in the cylinder and 5 more in a side-mounted internal box magazine, and when fired, an ejection mechanism similar in concept to the Silver & Fletcher Expert would expel a scent shell, while the loading mechanism on the other side of the gun would put in a fresh one. It also has a sliding cylinder that seals the chamber with the barrel on firing like a Nagant revolver, so you could, in theory, suppress the gun as well. Now, back on level 2, we talked about the AS Val and the VSS Vintorez, which is a 2-part weapons project from Russia to make a modular, integrally suppressed rifle. It was built to fire the 9x39 subsonic cartridge, which works great when fired through a suppressor, but is also great for close quarters engagements, leading to the development of the SR3 Vickr. Although essentially just a short barrel rework of the AS Val without the suppressor, it's got a few new additions and changes to make it function well as a compact assault rifle, such as a top folding buttstock and a dual side charging handle similar to the Scorpion. It also has a safety above the trigger instead of the AK style paddle lever thing. As a relatively expensive weapon to produce, the SR3 hasn't really seen a whole lot of use, but it has been seen in the hands of Russian special forces and FSB agents, which is basically their version of the FBI. Now, this next gun is very hard to explain because its mechanism is probably one of the weirdest, most unique, but also kind of dumbest ideas I've ever seen. This is the FDM L5. It's somewhere between a volley gun, a shotgun, and the HKG-11 because it fires all of the rounds on each of these charge blocks at once, using caseless ammunition that is activated with an electrical charge. It's been marketed as the next evolution in assault rifles, but there hasn't really been any substantial information on its development since 2018. The Pletter M91 was a submachine gun made under orders of the Croatian Ministry of Defense in 1991 to arm civilians and militia groups during the Yugoslav Wars, which, if you want to know how one man's intimate encounter with a beer bottle led to the entire downfall of a whole country, I made a video about the Yugoslav Wars a few months ago, and I think it's pretty cool and you should check it out. Anyway, the Pletter was built as a homegrown weapon for Croatian forces since embargoes and civil unrest made it difficult to get weapons into the country. It was heavily based on the Sten, with much of the mechanism nearly identical save for the vertical magazine well, which was modified to fit Uzi magazines. The Pletter saw a lot of circulation throughout Croatia and the surrounding area, with as many as 100 being made every day at the height of its production. Now, the open bolt blowback firing mechanism of guns like the Sten has been seen in a lot of small production submachine guns because, while not the most refined design out there, it's very simple and cheap to replicate. Many Polish resistance groups ran backyard gun factories where they made such guns to fight against German occupation. Some we already talked about, but since many of these insurrection groups were small and isolated, many of these resistance guns were understandably small production and really only used by the one group of the area they were made in. One such group was the KOP, or Komenda Obronko Polski, or Polish Defenders Command, who later reorganized into the PAL, or Polska Armia Ludowa, or Polish People's Army. And in 1942, Edward Włoskowski started making a submachine gun for them out of a secret workshop in Warsaw. Yet another Polish rebel machine gun was the KIS, which was basically just a straight Sten clone with a pistol grip instead of a stock. It was used by resistance forces in the Holy Cross mountain region in central Poland. The MG14Z is an experimental light machine gun project based on the MG3, which is a modernized reproduction of the German MG42. Rather than just two MG3s slapped together, it's built entirely from the ground up, with the only pre-built parts being the receivers, while the barrels, shrouds, feeding mechanisms, and trigger housings are all original. It also has an adjustable firing rate with an electric shot counter, and since it can top out at 3,000 rounds per minute, I'm pretty sure that the round counter comes in handy. The 1846 Postforverge Knifegun was made to arm Norwegian postmen in the mid-1800s in response to a spike in attacks on postal workers. Now, these altercations were almost always robberies to take valuable packages or money, but sometimes it resulted in the murder of the postmen themselves. The Norwegian government then started sending out armed guards with the mail transports, armed with this double-barrel bladed pistol. The two smoothbore barrels sit side by side with a dagger blade stretching out between them, and the hammers for both barrels double as the upper crossguard, and the triggers fold forward into the handle when not in use. Now, we did already talk about a few different knife guns already, but this one is a bit more unique since it was made to serve a specific purpose based on a direct need rather than just being a cool idea. The MD-74 Carpaty is a aluminum copper alloy frame, chrome-lined barrel Romanian Walther PPK knockoff, although it is not exactly a direct copy. It's been used extensively by the Romanian army and police, but it's slowly been phased out of active service for more powerful modern sidearms, although it is still kept on reserve and it is 100% on my to-buy list. The Demro Wasp was one of the last open-bolt semi-automatics made for the civilian market. Designer George Fox had tried to get earlier iterations of the gun off the ground, but both endeavors fell apart due to factory fires, which is weirdly coincidental. The third attempt didn't really work out either because Fox fell out with his business partners, and Demro went forward on the development without him. Now, superficially, it's somewhere between a Thompson, a PPSH, and an M4 grease gun in function, but it also has a few interesting qualities that are maybe a bit overthought, but weirdly enough, still kind of clever. For example, the rods that keep the adjustable stock in place can be pulled out and used as a pin punch and screwdriver, and the guide rod of the recoil spring pokes through the bolt carrier to double as the extractor. The Wasp saw a modest amount of circulation and had a few different variants made over its lifetime, which basically ended in 1983 when the ATF banned open bolt firearms on the civilian market due to how easy it is to convert that system to fire on full auto. Pistol caliber carbines have steadily grown in popularity over the years, and unfortunately, many come and go without much popularity despite being perfectly competent designs. Like the D-Max 100, which used the round bolt side-loading design of guns like the Sten or Sterling, and a trigger setup made with AK components. It came in a couple different calibers as well as both a pistol and full-length variant, but it never really set in with the police or civilians, and it has since slipped into obscurity. Another long-standing market that has seen plenty of short-lived or less popular entries are pocket pistols, like the Savage 1907. They were derived from the .45 caliber pistols submitted by Savage to the weapon trials that led to the 1911's adoption, but despite being a 118-year-old design, the Savage 1907 actually had some very forward-thinking qualities that wouldn't really feel out of place in a modern pistol. It's got things like a loaded chamber indicator, a manual thumb safety, and a cocking lever as well as a 10-round capacity, making it one of the earliest handguns to use a double-stack magazine, predating the Browning High Power by almost 30 years. The gun was largely marketed as a ladies' defense pistol and was even endorsed by figures such as Buffalo Bill Cody and the Pinkerton Agency, but Savage also gifted one to Teddy Roosevelt, and several thousand were contracted for use by the French and Portuguese militaries. So to call the Savage 1907 a less popular gun probably isn't super accurate, but being that it's kind of slipped into obscurity for the simple fact of just being old, it's definitely worth talking about. The M231 port gun was a specialized M16 made for firing out of a Bradley M2. The first versions came with a basic sight and a simple wire stock, but as these were just glorified port guns, the stock and sights were later removed and the guns were made designated defense weapons that couldn't be removed from the Bradley and used tracer rounds. The function was modified from a standard M16, the most distinct being that it was converted to open bolt full auto fire, which required several modifications to things like the bolt carrier itself, the buffer tube, the recoil system, and the trigger. There's also a metal plate fixed over the fire selector that only allows for safety or full auto fire, which was tuned up to a staggering 1,200 rounds per minute instead of the original M16 average of 800 rounds per minute. The front end of the handguard was also fixed with a threaded plate that you would screw into the port openings on the Bradley's doors to fight off anyone trying to close in on the vehicles. Putting port weapons on armored vehicles is not uncommon, but the idea behind the M231 is definitely an interesting take on the concept, especially since the guys inside these vehicles already have the gun the thing's built off of, that would probably work just as fine. Now, all the way back on level 1 of the Iceberg, we talked about what is probably the quintessential weird gun in a lot of people's minds, the HKG-11. But some of you might not know that there is an even weirder version of the gun in the LMG-11, which was a higher capacity, break-action, revolver machine gun thing. The general idea was the same as the base G11, but rather than the stick magazines that loaded over the barrel, the LMG-11 loaded ammo off of a larger box magazine that mounted into a compartment at the back of the gun, then fed into a 3-chambered loading cylinder that moved rounds from the magazine to the firing chamber to allow for cooling, since it was intended for sustained fire. Since the entire G11 project and the various weapons programs it was submitted for never really worked out, the LMG-11 didn't really see much development beyond a few prototypes and some very basic testing. Despite its nickname, the Fusil Automático Doble, or FAD, has remained in service with the Peruvian military for close to 20 years, although it's never seen use anywhere else. It's a bullpup assault rifle designed and produced domestically as a cost-effective replacement for the HK-33s previously used by the Peruvian Army. The magazine loads in at a leftward angle, similar to something like the AN-94, which, fun fact, the Peruvian Army chose the FAD over purely due to cost. The FAD is probably most well known around the world for appearing in games like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 and Ghosts, but neither of these games depict its built-in 40mm grenade launcher, whose charging handle doubles as a partial trigger guard. The FAD has only ever been made and used for domestic military use within Peru, and that's why it's remained relatively obscure since its introduction. The NTW-20 is a South African anti-material rifle produced by Denel Land Systems, the same guys that develop wacky guns like the Nkuzi Pa and CR-21 that we've already talked about. The NTW-20 was developed in less than 5 months, largely inspired by the recoil reduction systems in helicopter turrets, and used several parts from Denel's Vector GA1 automatic cannon to cut down on production time and cost. It's also technically a multi-caliber rifle since it can chamber both 20x82 and 14.5x114 with a barrel and bolt swap. In 2013, the NTW-20 made its way into the Sniper Rifle Hall of Fame when a South African Special Forces officer made the 6th longest confirmed kill in history at 2,125 meters, or about 1.3 miles. A year before the assault weapons ban in 1994, Olympic Arms introduced a unique AR-15 pistol that eliminated the stock and buffer tube, swapping the recoil system of a traditional AR-15 for one built over the barrel. By the time it was ready for production, the assault weapons ban was already in effect, so Olympic Arms had to make a few reworks to keep the gun marketable, eventually reintroducing it as the OA-96. By the language of the assault weapons ban, the original design was considered an assault pistol, mainly because it had a detachable magazine that didn't mount into the gun through the pistol grip. So all they did was fix the magazine into the frame of the gun with some epoxy and made a quick release button to pop the gun open and load the magazine with stripper clips. But of course, this kind of defeats the purpose of the original gun, and the assault weapons ban was ultimately a pointless endeavor as well, and Olympic Arms made a newer version of the gun with a detachable magazine the next year anyway. The Cosmi SRL was a break-action semi-automatic shotgun that loads backwards into a magazine tube in the buttstock. It's made in small numbers and often catches a high price due to its unique and complicated mechanism that is largely made up of hand-fitted parts. The Armalite AR-17 is a 2-shot semi-automatic shotgun made by Armalite with a buffer and bolt system similar to the AR-15. It has no magazine tube and just holds the second round under the firing chamber, and nearly the entire gun, including the barrel, is made of aluminum to keep the weight down, which was the main marketing point of the gun. Armalite wanted to sell the lightest shotgun on the market at the time, and at only around 5 pounds, the AR-17 met that goal, which also ended up as one of its biggest flaws because it turned out that it was too lightweight. Because it didn't have much heft to it, the recoil is pretty strong to the point of being unpleasant to shoot for an extended period of time, like, say, clay tournaments, which the gun was mainly designed for, and it's also very awkward to hold, aim, and follow through shots with because it feels like you're barely holding anything. There were plans to produce at least 20,000 of them, but it's not known how many were actually assembled and sold since they are a bit of a rarity nowadays, but the AR-17 is a great example of a good idea executed kind of poorly. The Beretta Prola and CZ-241 are European shotguns produced as dupes of the Browning Auto 5. Mechanically, they are both typical semi-automatic shotguns modeled after the Browning design, but they each have a few unique qualities that make them worth mentioning. The Beretta can be fully disassembled without the use of any tools or additional equipment, and weighs less than the Browning Auto 5, with the caveat of costing about 23% more. While it didn't make a huge impact on the shotgun market, the Beretta Prola is still important for inspiring a few different features seen in Benelli shotguns today. The CZ-241 was developed just 1 year before the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1938, but wouldn't see production until the end of the war from 1946 to 1949. As one of the lightest shotguns of its time, the 241's use of aluminum in parts like the trigger housing and receiver, as well as a maximum capacity of only 3 shells, kept its entire weight around 6.5 pounds. Like the Beretta, it didn't really see much popularity despite being a perfectly functional shotgun, and both can occasionally still be found today on collector's sites. Hopefully by now you've realized that there is no shortage of weird, wild, and wacky guns out there, and there are certainly plenty that I never even mentioned in this series, so maybe one day in the future I'll talk about some more if I can make a big enough list. But until then, I've got plenty of other fun topics to cover and cool stories to tell, so make sure you're subscribed to keep up. So thank you all for watching, and especially thank you to those of you who suggested the guns in this video, because it was really fun to learn about a whole new batch of guns I'd never even heard of, but it was even more fun to share it all with you. Goodbye, everyone.